Captain James "Jimmy" Nakamura gripped the control stick of his P-51 Mustang as the morning sun painted the Pacific sky in shades of gold and crimson. At 31 years old, he was considered a veteran pilot by 1945 standards, having survived 2 years of aerial combat in the European theater before volunteering for transfer to the Pacific. What made his story remarkable wasn't just his skill as a pilot, but the journey that had brought him to this moment. A Japanese American fighting against the land of his ancestors while his own family remains imprisoned in internment camps back in California. Jimmy had been born in Fresno to parents who had immigrated from Japan in the early 1900s, seeking the American dream through hard work and dedication. His father, Hiroshi, had built a successful agricultural business, growing grapes and vegetables on land he had leased, but could never own due to California's discriminatory laws. Jimmy had grown up straddling 2 cultures, speaking Japanese at home with his grandparents, while excelling in American schools and dreaming of becoming an aviator. Everything changed on December 7, 1941. Jimmy had been a senior at UC Berkeley, studying engineering and participating in the university's flying club, when news of Pearl Harbor reached the campus. Within hours, he watched his world crumble as anti-Japanese sentiment exploded across California. By February 1942, his entire family, parents, grandparents, younger sister, and infant nephew, had been forcibly relocated to Manzanar internment camp in the Owens Valley. The cruel irony wasn't lost on Jimmy. While his family was imprisoned behind barbed wire as suspected enemy aliens, he was determined to prove his loyalty to America by volunteering for military service. It took months of persistent applications and character references before the Army Air Corps finally accepted him in late 1942, making him one of only a handful of Japanese Americans allowed to serve as pilots during World War II. What would you do if your country imprisoned your family while asking you to risk your life in military service? Jimmy's training had been exceptional, but his path to combat had been complicated by prejudice and suspicion. Many of his fellow pilots initially viewed him with distrust, unsure whether someone of Japanese ancestry could be relied upon in combat against Japan. He had proven himself repeatedly in the European theater, shooting down 7 German aircraft and earning the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions during the D-Day invasion. Now, on April 12, 1945, Jimmy found himself flying with the 332nd Fighter Group, the famous Tuskegee Airmen, in a mission that would test every skill he had learned and every ounce of courage he possessed. The target was a heavily defended Japanese airfield on Kyushu, and intelligence reports indicated that the base housed a significant portion of Japan's remaining veteran pilots, including members of elite units being prepared for kamikaze operations. The mission briefing had been sobering. Colonel Davis, the commanding officer of the 332nd Fighter Group, had made it clear that this would be one of the most dangerous operations they had undertaken. The Japanese airfield was protected by sophisticated anti-aircraft defenses, surrounded by fighter squadrons, and located deep in enemy territory where rescue would be impossible if anyone was shot down. "Gentlemen," Colonel Davis had said, looking around the briefing room at the assembled pilots, "this mission has the potential to significantly impact Japanese air capabilities, but I won't lie to you. The odds of everyone returning are not good. Intelligence estimates suggest we'll face at least 50 enemy fighters, and their pilots are experienced and desperate." Jimmy had volunteered for the most dangerous part of the mission, serving as one of 4 pilots who would make low-level strafing runs on the airfield's fuel storage facilities, while the rest of the squadron engaged Japanese fighters at higher altitude. It was essentially a suicide mission,
requiring pilots to fly at extremely low altitude through intense anti-aircraft fire to destroy targets that would likely explode in massive fireballs. As the American formation approached the Japanese coast, Jimmy found himself thinking about his family in Manzanar. His last letter from his sister described the harsh conditions in the camp: the inadequate housing, the poor food, the constant surveillance, and the psychological toll of imprisonment without trial or due process. Yet despite everything they had endured, his family had never stopped supporting his military service, understanding that he was fighting not just for America, but for the principle that loyalty and courage should transcend ethnic ancestry. The irony of his situation was profound. Here he was, a Japanese-American pilot, about to attack a Japanese military installation while his own government held his family in concentration camps. He was fighting to prove his American identity while many of his fellow citizens questioned his right to exist in their country. The complexity of his position would have been paralyzing for some, but for Jimmy, it had crystallized into a simple determination to excel in service to the country he loved, despite its flaws. Have you ever found yourself caught between conflicting loyalties or identities? How did you resolve that internal struggle? As the American fighters crossed over Kyushu, Japanese air defenses immediately sprang into action. Anti-aircraft guns began firing from positions scattered across the landscape, filling the sky with black puffs of smoke and deadly shrapnel. More ominously, Japanese fighters began rising from multiple airfields to intercept the American formation, far more than intelligence had predicted. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high," crackled the voice of Lieutenant Johnson over the radio. "Looks like we've got company, boys." Jimmy could see them now. At least 70 Japanese fighters climbing rapidly to engage the American formation. The enemy aircraft included both veteran pilots flying modern fighters and younger pilots in older aircraft, but all of them were flying with the desperate aggression of men defending their homeland from invasion. The air battle that followed was unlike anything Jimmy had experienced in the European theater. While German pilots had been skilled and determined, these Japanese pilots were fighting with the fury of men who knew they were likely flying their last mission. Kamikaze tactics had affected not just designated suicide pilots, but the entire Japanese Air Force, creating a culture where death in combat was not just acceptable, but preferable to survival and defeat. Colonel Davis's voice came over the radio with crisp authority. "Nakamura, Williams, Thompson, Rodriguez, proceed to target as planned. Rest of the squadron will keep these fighters busy. Make your runs count, gentlemen." Jimmy broke formation with his 3 fellow pilots and dove toward the airfield, now clearly visible several miles ahead. The facility was larger than expected, with multiple runways, dozens of aircraft on the ground, and obvious fuel storage areas that would be their primary targets. But it was also more heavily defended than intelligence had indicated, with anti-aircraft guns positioned throughout the complex and what appeared to be additional fighter aircraft preparing for takeoff. As the 4 American fighters descended toward their target, Jimmy's radio crackled with reports from the ongoing air battle above. The Tuskegee Airmen were performing magnificently, but they were outnumbered and facing pilots who were willing to die rather than retreat. Several American aircraft had already been hit, and the fuel gauges on everyone's planes were indicating that they were approaching the point where return to base would become problematic. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Could you fly a suicide mission knowing your family was imprisoned by your own government? The approach to the target required Jimmy to fly at extremely low altitude to avoid radar detection and reduce exposure to anti-aircraft fire. But flying low also meant that when the defensive guns did acquire targets, the pilots would have virtually no time to evade. It was a calculated risk that prioritized mission success over pilot survival. As Jimmy's small formation approached the airfield perimeter, Japanese ground defenses opened up with everything they had. The sky filled with tracer rounds, explosive shells, and clouds of shrapnel that turned the air itself into a deadly environment. Jimmy could hear metal fragments hitting his aircraft's fuselage and wings, but his engine continued running smoothly and his controls remained responsive. "Stay tight, boys," Jimmy called over the radio. "We're going in fast and low. Hit the fuel storage area and get out. Don't linger for secondary targets." The fuel storage facility was located on the far side of the airfield, beyond the main runway and aircraft parking areas. Reaching it would require flying directly over the most heavily defended portion of the base, but the potential payoff was enormous. Destroying the fuel storage would not only eliminate aircraft on the ground, but would also prevent Japanese fighters from refueling for future operations. As Jimmy's Mustang roared across the airfield at nearly 400 miles per hour, he could see Japanese personnel diving for cover and anti-aircraft guns swiveling to track his flight path. The sensation was surreal. He was attacking an installation that could have been defended by distant relatives, flying against people who looked like his own family members while representing a country that had imprisoned his loved ones. But Jimmy's training and determination overrode any emotional complexity. His target was clearly visible ahead, a cluster of large fuel storage tanks surrounded by smaller buildings and connected by a network of pipelines. Intelligence had indicated that destroying this facility would eliminate fuel supplies for several hundred aircraft and significantly impact Japanese air operations in the region. The attack run required precision flying under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Jimmy had to maintain extremely low altitude to avoid radar detection and reduce exposure to anti-aircraft fire. But flying low also meant that when the defensive guns did acquire targets, the pilots would have virtually no time to evade. It was a calculated risk that prioritized mission success over pilot survival. As Jimmy's small formation approached the airfield perimeter, Japanese ground defenses opened up with everything they had. The sky filled with tracer rounds, explosive shells, and clouds of shrapnel that turned the air itself into a deadly environment. Jimmy could hear metal fragments hitting his aircraft's fuselage and wings, but his engine continued running smoothly and his controls remained responsive. Quicker question: could you maintain such precise control of an aircraft while under intense enemy fire? As Jimmy approached the fuel storage area, time seemed to slow down. He could see individual Japanese soldiers manning anti-aircraft positions, their faces clearly visible as they tracked his aircraft with their weapons. Some of them looked incredibly young, probably teenagers who had been pressed into military service as Japan's situation became increasingly desperate. For a split second, Jimmy found himself looking into the eyes of a young Japanese gunner who couldn't have been more than 17 years old. The boy's face showed a mixture of fear and determination that reminded Jimmy of his own younger cousins back in California. But there was no time for such reflections. The mission had to be completed regardless of personal feelings. Jimmy opened fire with his aircraft's 6.50 caliber machine guns, sending streams of armor-piercing incendiary rounds into the fuel storage tanks. The effect was immediate and spectacular. The first tank exploded in a massive fireball that rose hundreds of feet into the air, followed quickly by secondary explosions as the fire spread to adjacent tanks and pipeline connections. The explosion was so intense that Jimmy's aircraft was buffeted by the blast wave, nearly throwing him out of control. Flaming fuel rained down across the airfield, setting fire to aircraft, buildings, and anything else it touched. Within seconds, the entire fuel storage area had become an inferno that would burn for hours. But Jimmy's success came at a cost. The explosion had occurred so close to his aircraft that burning fuel had splashed across his wings and fuselage, and several pieces of shrapnel from the blast had punctured his engine cowling. More seriously, the intense heat from the fireball had damaged his aircraft's cooling system, causing the engine temperature to rise rapidly toward dangerous levels.
Lieutenant Williams, flying on Jimmy's wing, had been caught even closer to the explosion. His aircraft emerged from the fireball trailing smoke and flames, with obvious damage to the tail section and left wing. Over the radio, Williams reported that his controls were severely damaged and his engine was losing power rapidly. "I'm hit bad, Jimmy," Williams called over the radio, his voice tight with pain and fear. "Engine's cutting out and I can't maintain altitude. I don't think I'm going to make it back to base." The decision Jimmy faced in that moment would define the rest of his life. Military protocol dictated that pilots should return to base as quickly as possible after completing their mission, especially when their own aircraft was damaged. Staying in the area to help a disabled comrade would expose both pilots to additional risk from Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Let us know in the comments what you would have done in Jimmy's situation. But Jimmy had learned something important during his time with the Tuskegee Airmen, that brotherhood transcended racial boundaries, and that true loyalty meant never abandoning a comrade. The men of the 332nd Fighter Group had accepted him despite his Japanese ancestry, judging him by his actions rather than his ethnicity. Now it was his turn to demonstrate that same loyalty. "Williams, this is Nakamura," Jimmy radioed back. "I'm staying with you. We'll get you home." What followed was one of the most harrowing flights in the history of aerial combat. With Japanese fighters continuing to pursue them and Williams' aircraft barely maintaining altitude, Jimmy had to navigate a damaged plane through hostile airspace while protecting a wounded comrade who could barely control his aircraft. The journey back toward American-controlled airspace required flying at extremely low altitude to avoid Japanese radar and fighter patrols. Jimmy's engine was overheating badly, requiring him to reduce power periodically to prevent complete failure, while Williams' aircraft was losing altitude steadily despite maximum power settings. 20 minutes into their escape flight, Japanese fighters caught up with them. 4 enemy aircraft attacked from above, diving down in an attempt to finish off the 2 damaged American planes. Jimmy found himself in the impossible position of trying to defend both aircraft while dealing with his own mechanical problems. The air combat that followed tested every skill Jimmy had developed over 3 years of flying. With an overheating engine and limited ammunition, he had to outmaneuver Japanese fighters who were flying undamaged aircraft and had the advantage of numbers. But Jimmy had learned to maximize every advantage available to him, using his knowledge of American aircraft capabilities and his understanding of Japanese tactics to stay one step ahead of his pursuers. In a series of desperate maneuvers, Jimmy managed to shoot down one Japanese fighter and drive off the others, but the effort had pushed his damaged engine beyond its limits. Engine temperature was now in the red zone, and he could see coolant streaming from damaged lines. He estimated that he had perhaps 10 minutes of flying time before complete engine failure. Williams' situation was even critical. His aircraft was now flying barely above stall speed and losing altitude steadily, despite maximum power settings. Share your thoughts about the kind of loyalty and brotherhood that would drive someone to such extremes. It was then that Jimmy made the decision that would define his legacy as a pilot and as a person. Rather than continuing toward American lines where he might save his own life, he chose to escort Williams to a small island that intelligence had indicated might have been recaptured by American forces. The detour would use up his remaining fuel and engine time, making his own survival unlikely. But it would give Williams a chance to crash land in friendly territory. "Williams, head for that small island at 2 o'clock. Intelligence says it might be in American hands. I'll stay with you as long as I can." The final minutes of the flight were a testament to both pilots' skill and determination. With engines failing and fuel running low, they managed to reach the small island just as American ground forces were completing their occupation of the Japanese garrison. Williams' aircraft crash-landed on the island's small airstrip, and although he was injured, he survived to be evacuated by American medical personnel. Jimmy's aircraft ran out of fuel just as he confirmed that Williams had landed safely. With no power and no options, he attempted a dead-stick landing on the rocky coastline of the same island. The crash was devastating. His P-51 Mustang was completely destroyed, and Jimmy suffered multiple injuries that would end his flying career. But he had survived, and more importantly, he had saved the life of a fellow pilot who might otherwise have been lost. When rescue personnel reached the crash site, they found Jimmy conscious and asking about Williams' condition before expressing any concern about his own injuries. The aftermath of the mission revealed its true significance. The fuel storage facility that Jimmy had destroyed contained enough aviation fuel to support Japanese air operations for several weeks. Its loss significantly impacted Japan's ability to conduct air operations in the final months of the war, contributing to the Allied victory in the Pacific theater. More importantly for the war effort, the mission demonstrated that American air power could successfully penetrate even heavily defended Japanese positions and destroy critical infrastructure. The psychological impact on Japanese leadership was significant, contributing to their growing realization that continued resistance was futile. For Jimmy personally, the mission marked the end of his combat flying career, but the beginning of a different kind of service. His actions had finally silenced any questions about the loyalty and courage of Japanese Americans in military service. When news of the mission reached the United States, it contributed to growing pressure for the release of Japanese Americans from internment camps. Let us know how this story of courage and sacrifice against impossible odds affected you. Jimmy spent 3 months recovering from his injuries in a military hospital in the Philippines, during which time he received word that his family had been released from Manzanar and allowed to return to California. The irony wasn't lost on him. His willingness to sacrifice his life for his country had finally convinced that same country that his family deserved to be treated as loyal Americans. But the personal cost had been enormous. Jimmy's injuries prevented him from ever flying again, ending the career that had defined his identity since childhood. Moreover, his family's farm in Fresno had been lost during their internment, sold for a fraction of its value to pay taxes and maintenance costs while they were imprisoned. When Jimmy finally returned to California in late 1945, he found a family that had been fundamentally changed by their experience of imprisonment and discrimination. His father, once a proud and successful businessman, had been broken by the experience of losing everything he had worked for. His sister had married another internment camp resident and was struggling to rebuild her life from nothing. But Jimmy also found a country that was slowly beginning to acknowledge the injustice of what had been done to Japanese Americans. His military service and that of other Japanese American soldiers had begun to change public opinion about the loyalty and courage of Americans of Japanese ancestry. Jimmy used his veterans' benefits to attend law school, eventually becoming an advocate for civil rights and redress for internment camp survivors. He spent the remainder of his career fighting legal battles to ensure that what happened to his family would never happen again to any group of Americans. The medals Jimmy earned for his military service, including the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Purple Heart, and the Silver Star, were displayed in his law office as reminders of what could be accomplished when people were judged by their actions rather than their ancestry. But he always said that his greatest pride came not from his individual achievements, but from proving that loyalty to America transcended ethnic background. In 1988, more than 40 years after the end of World War II, the United States government formally apologized for the internment of Japanese Americans and provided financial compensation to survivors. Jimmy, then 74 years old, was among those who received reparations, but he said the apology was more important than the money. Share your thoughts about how this story demonstrates the complexity of American identity and the power of individual courage. Jimmy Nakamura died in 2003 at the age of 89, having lived long enough to see his country acknowledge the injustice of internment, while also recognizing the extraordinary service of Japanese American military personnel during World War II. His funeral was attended by veterans from multiple wars, civil rights leaders, and former internment camp survivors who credited his example with inspiring their own struggles for justice and recognition. The P-51 Mustang that Jimmy flew on his final mission was never recovered from the Pacific island where it crashed. But in 2015, marine archaeologists located the wreckage and recovered several artifacts, including Jimmy's flight helmet and his personal prayer book,
a small volume that contained both Christian prayers and Buddhist meditations, reflecting the dual spiritual traditions that had sustained him throughout his life. These artifacts are now displayed in the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History as part of an exhibit on Japanese-American military service during World War II. The display includes photographs of Jimmy throughout his life, as a young college student, as a pilot in training, as a decorated veteran, and as an elderly civil rights attorney. Each image tells part of the story of what it meant to be an American when that identity was questioned and challenged by prejudice and fear. Jimmy's story has become an inspiration for military personnel from all backgrounds who have faced discrimination while serving their country. His example demonstrates that true patriotism sometimes requires serving a country that doesn't fully appreciate your service, fighting for ideals that aren't always perfectly implemented, and maintaining faith in America's potential even when its reality falls short. The small prayer book that Jimmy carried on his final mission contains a handwritten note that he added after returning from the Pacific. Today, I flew into certain death for a country that imprisoned my family. Tomorrow, I will work to make that country worthy of such sacrifice. It serves as a reminder that the work of perfecting American democracy requires not just military service, but continued civilian engagement in the cause of justice and equality. Captain James Nakamura's legacy extends far beyond his individual achievements as a pilot. He represents the thousands of Americans who have served their country despite facing discrimination and prejudice, proving through their actions that loyalty and courage transcend ethnic, racial, and religious boundaries. His story reminds us that American identity is not determined by ancestry or appearance, but by commitment to the principles of freedom, justice, and equality that define the nation at its best. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment to share your thoughts.